So I'm very happy to introduce today's program. How many goodly creatures are there here? Thematic finding aids for collections at Shakespeare's Globe, and our guest, Dr. Philip Milnes-Smith. Philip works as the digital archivist at Shakespeare's Globe. He also volunteers for the Archives and Records Association as co-training officer for the Archives for Learning and Education section. As one of the ARA's diversity and inclusion allies, he has co-led disability and accessibility training for record keepers. He founded the Disability Collections Forum in 2022. Welcome, Philip.
Thank you very much. I will attempt to share my screen. It worked before, so. Hopefully everybody can see. Well, thank you everybody, and welcome, and I'll just launch into it. I hope there'll be some questions to follow up. In this presentation, I'll be sharing recent work I've led here at Shakespeare's Globe, creating 4 subject guides to finding disability, gender, queerness and race in our collections, and they will be published in January 2025. And just to note, it's clearly timely to be talking about subject guides, as I note that Catherine Christensen has just written an article on providing effective subject access to archival collections in the current issue of Archival Outlook. Taking one theme, race, as an example, I want to start with our responsibility to be open about the context in which my organisation is operating, which has resulted in an archive centred on the works of Shakespeare and his contemporaries. Shakespeare is seen as, in Farah Karim Cooper's words, quotes, an icon of white excellence, close quotes, and was co-opted into colonial projects with ongoing ramifications, including, for example, Eugene Schieffelin's release of 60 Starlings in New York's Central Park in 1890. His plays also have a history of being taught in such a way that, for example, the writer and civil rights activist James Baldwin had considered him, quotes, one of the authors and architects of my oppression, close quotes. The Globe, too, is often perceived as white space. Unfortunately, some people like it that way, and the theatre has had pushback, both when presenting, for example, actors from the global majority, such as our all women of colour production of Richard II, and when talking about race in the plays, such as the anti-racist Shakespeare webinar series. It's important to note that my work has been undertaken against a background of Western culture wars in which there can be press and political hostility to talking about certain individuals and histories. It's important to remember that our profession has consistently acted as a branch of eternal PR for those who once had power, reflecting too often only their terms and attitudes. For example, in the old collection level description of the Bristol Society of Merchant Venturers, the word trade was used, whitewashing the fact that this had included trafficking in enslaved people. The Society had counted Edward Colston as a member for 38 years, and its 21st century members contested attempts to recontextualize the statue of him, which celebrated him only as a generous philanthropist and model Bristolian without acknowledging the source of his wealth. My project was funded by the UK National Archives through a research and innovation grant, and therefore, as the outputs go out into the world, we will be at risk of provocative stories about whether this was a good use of taxpayers' money. While we have the freedom of being an independent arts organisation rather than publicly funded institutions like the National Theatre or the Royal Shakespeare Company, we've also often been in the firing line. This knowledge impacted how we frame our arguments about what we're doing. This leads me to the need to acknowledge another broader context. Attending the ICA SUV conference back in October, I was very struck by the reported chilling effect of anti-DEI sentiment and even legislation stateside, as described by some of those presenting. Undoubtedly, some in the audience today may have less freedom than others to undertake the kind of work I'm describing in the near future. However, I'm also aware of keepers and curators acting in ways that have been construed, justifiably or not, as what Snyder has termed, quotes, anticipatory obedience, close quotes, with attempts to edit out the uncomfortable and contested in an effort to seem non-partisan. I'll return to Dr. Shogun later. For now, I want instead to mention Vern Harris's idea of archival banditry, which I heard about first at the conference in October. He suggests work should be undertaken because the archivist is, quotes, haunted by the ghosts of the ones excluded, sidelined, not listened to, dispossessed, and in other ways oppressed, close quotes, and because, quotes, the call of justice is the most important one sounding in the ears of human beings, close quote. Shakespeare's Globe is a decades-long theatrical experiment on the south bank of the Thames in London, metres from the site of the original playhouse built for Shakespeare's company. The slide shows the exterior of our two theatres, the thatched, half-timbered open-air Globe Theatre and the brick exterior of the enclosed Sam Wanamaker Playhouse, which is named after our founder but attempts to recreate an indoor Jacobean theatre. The outdoor playhouse in particular is a shared light space where the audience co-create the performance in a way fundamentally different from a black box theatre. The archive was part of our founder's vision for the site from the very beginning, but our current premises are not really adequate. Space is at a premium and it's not very accessible, as you can possibly see in the image on the left. It's very tightly packed. A more visible and accessible research centre is in the works for 2025. So there's a bottom right sneak preview image is an architect's visualization from the stage 3 REBA stage, and it's yet to be publicly shared. So I'm happy to share that with you today. Ahead of reopening, the creation of these guides will support our own subject knowledge to develop community programming that could extend our reach to broader audiences, as well as helping new audiences find themselves in our collections. Organisationally, the archive, research and collections, sits within the higher education and research team, which also offers an MA in Shakespeare Studies, taught in partnership with King's College London. Those students are one imagined audience for the guides. Other audiences that will benefit are institutional university library subscribers and their users of digital collections available on the AM, formerly Adam Matthew platform. However, these resources are being made freely accessible from our website. I'm sorry they're not there yet. We hope that they will be found by learners who, for example, are encountering issues in the plays that their teachers and lecturers are studiously avoiding, or in some cases, whose legislatures have decided that Shakespeare is too dangerous for impressionable young minds to read in full. Back in 2022, we had a new library and archive manager, and we're experimenting with internal visibility within the organisation, arranging temporary displays of material related to previous productions of a newly programmed show. We knew that a piece of new writing was being platformed about Joan of Arc. Initially, we thought we could look thematically at women in new writing in the display. However, we then learned that Joan was being imagined as non-binary. The picture shows the cast of Charlie Josephine's I, Joan on the Globe stage. We wanted to shift to queer identities in new writing, but it was immediately obvious that the catalogue alone could not support that because, for example, there were no subject tags. To identify characters with queer identities, we needed to look at reviews that we were not keeping. We had no internal records to support the research. In creating the display, another problem was revealed. Sometimes queerness was in the published script, but the lines actually cut in performance. Sometimes queerness was embodied on stage with characters who were collections of, frankly, negative stereotypes. So mere representation alone was not all we needed to know. With these ideas bubbling away under the surface for a year or so, the opportunity arose in the summer of 2023 to dedicate some time to roughing out a version of 2 of the guides that would enable internal stakeholders to see it was worth the investment of time. I made a start on disability and race just to get a feel for what they would feature and contain. Initially, I had thought of just one additional guide on queerness, but I soon realised that some of what I wanted to surface would only happen if I added a gender guide, which you can see is now the longest. I'll say more about the timeline later, but I just want for now to give you a sense of the richness that the catalogue was missing out by showing the number of hits for disability, race, queerness, and gender, and then the number of pages in the current document drafts. So that's 4, 58, 13, and 17 for the number of hits, to 117, 145, 156, and 286 for the number of pages. I'm not going to have time to go through all of these, and some I will mention subsequently. If there's one I don't speak to, feel free to follow up with me about it afterwards. The first thing to say is that I've taken an affirmative action approach, highlighting identities that were previously underserved and underrepresented, rather than reburying them by also including a majority. That means, for example, we have a queerness guide and not a sexuality guide. It also reflects decisions made within the guides. For example, we're looking at those not assumed to be here. So in the race guide, we're listing performers and creators of colour, for example, but not white people. And we do make it clear that that's not because white people don't have a race. Similarly, in the gender guide, the creatives we point to are drawn wider than just director and writer, including, for example, composers, fight directors, and designers. Secondly, we needed the guides to be both standalone and to point to each other. For example, when Edgar is disguising himself as a madman in King Lear, he's also changing his appearance with blackface. When Falstaff self-describes as a sow and references his womb, conceptions of masculinity are being toyed with. But questions are also raised about his body, which is being presented as non-normative, sick, monstrous, disabled. Looking at the themes in the texts of the plays, as well as the productions, enables us to point beyond our 20th and 21st century performance history to the early modern London, where the plays at the heart of our repertoire were first performed. For example, it was not wholly white. Disabled people would have been not only in the first audiences, but also writing and performing. The gender binary was being troubled in dress and conduct by both men and women, and people who lived unconventionally, like the playwrights Beaumont and Fletcher, were attracting remark. Finally, the idea is that with the past covered, it will be manageable to update them annually to incorporate new productions. Although this shared framework suggests similarity between the guides, there are, I think, enough differences for the guides to have different personalities. With a performing arts audience in mind, I want to start introducing some of the details. Taking the gender guide, for example, Shakespeare's female characters are listed. This includes characters with no spoken lines and characters who are mentioned but do not appear in the play. So, for example, in the play Othello, there's Barbary, whose willow song is misremembered by Desdemona, and there's also the Egyptian woman responsible for the handkerchief, neither of whom are embodied on stage. The storyline and vocabulary about these female characters introduced. In many cases, that storyline is very much not a character arc, as it's the male protagonists who were foregrounded in the play. And we do note, for example, that in A Midsummer Night's Dream, neither Helena nor Hermia speak after they're married. The female characters' literacy, if evident, is surfaced, and a suggestion made about their social status. For other plays, whether early modern or new writing, the guide raises particularly female-gendered aspects in the play, sometimes with textual quotations. So, for example, for the play A Warning for Fair Women, the guide says, quotes, based on real events, the play retells the story of Anne Sanders, first tempted into adultery by her friend, the widow Anne Drury, and then implicated in the death of her husband. Both are executed. lust and chastity personified, as well as justice, mercy, and diligence appear in dumb show, as well as the Furies, close quote. With Richard Broom's play, The Antipodes, the note says, quotes, in the supposed reversed world of the Antipodes, women behave like men and vice versa. So there, the merchants' wives do deal abroad beyond seas, while their husbands cuckold them at home. One scene includes a man scold being ducked, while another features a buff woman boxer who looks as she could beat out a whole tavern garrison, end of quotes. For the flying lovers of Vitebsk, the description changes the focus of interest of how the play was described by critics to say, quotes, based on the life of the writer Bella Rosenfeld and her husband, the painter Marc Chagall, for whom she was a muse and to whose interest she sacrifices her own, the play follows their escape from anti-Semitic pogroms in Russia and then Vichy France, end of quote. Of Jessica Swale's Blue Stockings, it says, quotes, the play, dedicated to Malala Yousafzai, explores the admission of women at Girton College to access higher education, but not yet graduate, in the late 19th century in the face of opposition. It grapples with who had opportunities to study. A gifted student is sent home because a death means she has family responsibilities that must halt her self-development, and how far it was possible to push women's rights in that moment, end of quote. But the gender guide does not only consider girl and women characters, it also looks at both ungendered and ambiguously gendered characters, and also males who don't appear to perform their masculinity correctly. With disability, the introduction says as follows, quotes, this guide considers disability quite broadly, including, for example, people with physical bodily differences or sensory differences, differences in mental health or neurodivergence, and intellectual disability, end of quote. We took the deliberate decision to include old age within our broad framing of disability, quotes, partly in recognition of the stereotypes of the past, but also of the reality that disability is ultimately part and parcel of many human lifespans, notwithstanding the scientific advances subsequently made, close quotes. In a world where critics can write with apparent seriousness that Richard III is Shakespeare's only disabled protagonist, we're asking people to imagine possibility rather than dismissing disability as a vanishingly rare category. The disability guide then divides characters up into those who are so characterized at their first appearance, those who become disabled during the action of the play, those who pretend to be disabled, and those where disability could maybe be inferred from lines in the text, but where there remains uncertainty. The queerness guide has the following subsections: characters with evidence of same gender desire, affection, and intimacy, characters resistant to or avoiding heterosexual coupling, characters whose conduct challenges convention, that's to say gender non-conforming, and characters portrayed as at odds with binary conceptions of appearance based on dress and accoutrements. In the latter case, we note that, quotes, a queer reading of these examples leaves open a variety of possibilities for the characters, including that they are dressing outside the binary as experimentation, for example, or for protection, for their own entertainment or that of others, or revealing a true identity or an aspect of it. The term cross-dressing, although widely used in theatrical scholarship, has been deliberately avoided because it reinforces heteronormativity, close quotes. This guide is also the only one quoting whole gobbets of text rather than just individual words and phrases. By contrast, when looking at race making, however, we're sharing only the characters where language is being used in the plays to create racial difference between them. So that's broader than just differences in physical characteristics like skin color or hair, including geographical origin, religion, culture. So, for example, it includes colonized Irish characters who are being differentiated from the English, but not every incidental invocation of the dark fair binary, such as Juliet, for example, gleaming like a jewel in an African's ear. Another lens we used was around casting, so where disability was in the public domain, but without any associating any individual with any particular diagnosis, we have sought to create discoverability for disabled performers in different ways. We list separately those with non-visible disabilities and those whose differences may not be read as disabling. We also distinguish whether the deployment of actors with visible disabilities was integral to a production or incidental. Obviously here, the same actor could appear in both lists depending on the production. We also highlight productions where disabled characterization was indicated through props, such as dark glasses or a wheelchair or a cane. For gender, we've listed productions with all male or if all female casts, with non-binary casting, and a recent development without cis men. But again, we wanted to distinguish different types of performance. So ensemble, often but not always touring productions, can have gender neutral casting of multiple roles, but then they would be contrasted with those productions where there were individual roles cast against gender, and those where there was flipped gender characterization involving subtle changes to names and switching of pronouns. And in some cases, this can have queer potential, as when in our 2016 Dream, the role of Helena was reimagined as Helenus. In these two snips from the guides, you can see how in these cases, the gender guide referring to Queen Margaret in Richard III points here to the disability guide, and that the disability guide here referring to Caliban points to the race guide. In the example on this slide, we see that sometimes it even proves possible to identify a real early modern person lurking behind the staged representation of bodily difference. The text of the play Old Fortunatus explicitly links the experience of Agrippine with the little Welshwoman, who we know was Margaret Griffith, displayed in London in 1588. Other real early modern disabled people lie behind the characters of, for example, Will Sommers, Henry VIII's fool, and Blue John in Robert Armin's The Two Maids of Morclack. It's good to be able to point to them in the guide to help repopulate the past with people we're not used to thinking about when we imagine it. An important aspect of the research and innovation bid was that funding would enable us to pay honoraria to a community panel pictured on the slide at our February and April meetings of those with lived experience across all 4 areas. We didn't really know how much interest there would be. Shakespeare may not be everyone's cup of tea for a variety of reasons, including those alluded to earlier in the presentation. In fact, we had more applicants than we could practically accept, and the youngest of those was not yet 18 when the first meetings took place. Their job was not only to attend 3 in-person meetings and contribute to discussion, but to have read the documents in advance, to have sent comments through that were either immediately addressed or brought to the meeting for more general discussion. Although I ran those meetings, I was supported to focus on content by having a moderator to enforce timings if need be, and also to take really valuable notes. And I'm pleased to say that many panelists have agreed to continue their relationship with us as we develop our new reading room and its offers. One additional project arose out of discussing the drafts with the panel. They wanted a timeline to be able to see the relative chronologies of these plays. Publication date is an unhelpful metric. It's interesting, but it's unhelpful because publication could come years, decades, or even centuries after performance. Borrowings between plays can happen without publication. Dating the earliest performance is usually difficult. There's no guarantee that the version printed closely resembled that first performance. That having been said, we have created a timeline, subject tagged with reference back to the subject guides. And in consultation with the Royal National Institute for Blind People, a prose screen reader accessible alternative to the very visual medium of a timeline has been prepared for simultaneous launch. That's the front text on the screen. Obviously, I'm very grateful that we were successful in our bid for a TNA Research and Innovation grant, and presenting at sessions like this is, I hope, helping to justify that investment. The time between submitting The grant application and launching the 4 guides is only about a year, but if you were thinking of embarking on this sort of work, I would just remind you of the additional year of thinking that underpinned the first proof of concept drafts. I haven't mentioned yet that I haven't been doing all the research myself. The funding means that I've been able to be supported by a freelance academic researcher, and I'm also supported by academic colleagues in the organisation who have contributed the introductory essays. What I learned is that I should have budgeted for some proofreading time, which is why it's not going to be ready until January, as it was hard for team members with other responsibilities to turn the proofreading round fast enough. I hope I've said enough to be clear that our existing catalogues may only be helping us to find a limited number of those represented in our collections. The strength of our approach was that when looking for one thing, for example, gender, we had somewhere to log what we found out about, for example, disability. Other similar projects have done one thing at a time, and they will need to look again if they want to find what they were not looking for the first time. Creating these guides as alternative finding aids was something that was fundable as a project. In my view, they don't duplicate the catalogue. They do open up our collections to those for whom the catalogue will always remain a barrier, not an aid. Having said that, some of what we've learned will feed back into catalogue description, but that's not a time-limited project. That's going to be every archivist's job forever. Archivists have understandably tended to like certainty and to state facts proved beyond reasonable doubt. The subject guides, however, allow for possibility and for divergent readings, including from community perspectives, and for people to make up their own minds. Catalogues are not so well placed to do this. In both, the language we choose to use has to be thought about carefully. We want to avoid anachronism and offence, but equally past terms may not alert us to what past authors had in mind. So thinking, for example, of Bottom in A Midsummer Night's Dream, we may hear the word monster and not realise that the original audiences were, at least in part, thinking of disability. Finally, I really think that the costs of community partnership have to become factored into our annual business plans rather than being reserved for projects. Particularly given the ongoing lack of diversity in the profession, we need to draw on experts by experience and build relationships if we're to reach people who are not like us. I want to close briefly by turning to the title quote, which is from the not unproblematic play, The Tempest. Miranda has grown up on an island with very limited experience of humanity and is exclaiming, "How many goodly creatures are there here?" because seeing new things is wonderful. There can be no question that there are gaps and silences in what has been deposited and collected in all our repositories, and this will continue to be the case unless we change our practices. However, it's also important to note that researchers wanting to find the contributions that have been made by people other than, say, straight, white, non-disabled, cis men encounter difficulties partly because archival good practice has continued to assume a default record creator and maybe also a default user. It's hoped that the thematic subject guides for the collections at Shakespeare's Globe, which I've discussed today, will give readers the same experience when encountering the many goodly creatures in our collections, many of whom are simply not findable in our catalogue. This project acknowledges Maria Ramirez's summation that, quotes, "It is not enough to collect with an eye towards diversity without expanding the ranks of those who do the collecting," end of quote, and I would add, describing. And Michelle Caswell's assertion that archivists too have, quotes, "ethical responsibilities," close quotes, and an obligation to engage them at every stage, including representation and use. Green noted that Vern Harris, that I mentioned for archival banditry, had been aware of the dangers in abandoning the notion, quotes, of the archivist as impartial custodian, close quotes, and I suspect that he might have considered that we have been pursuing a, quotes, political agenda, close quotes. However, I would suggest rather that we have embraced an opportunity to be even more impartial, offering greater objectivity than a profession passively accepting the symbolic annihilation of many from, quotes, our collective memories, close quotes, not least by drawing on community perspectives. Our aim is for an even more, quotes, neutral ground, close quotes, than one that supports the status quo and operates as if no biases and privileges exist, preventing genuine meritocracy in discoverability. One where, in Dr. Shogun's words in the latest archival outlook, quotes, everyone can engage meaningfully with the rich historical resources in our care, close quotes, where we, quotes, serve all with honesty, fairness, and integrity, close quotes, quotes, ensure current and future generations connect with and learn from our shared past, close quotes, and, quotes, enrich public understanding, close quotes. So I'd like to thank the SAA Performing Arts section for programming this event and the opportunity to share my work. I look forward to discussion later in this session. Please follow up by email if you want to learn more. I'm going to stop sharing.
Thank you, Philip. Please use the raise your hand if you want to ask your question live, or feel free to put it in the chat if you'd prefer someone read it for you. I'll start off by asking, could you expand a little on how you recruited participants for the community panels?
Yeah, so we worked out a form of words and we ran it past HR in the organization. So it did go out on our website, and I suspect most people found us there. I did try and approach local community groups, but at the moment our local connections are not great, and I didn't get a great deal of replies to when I was reaching out. But one local LGBTQ centre said, yes, they would be very happy to advertise it for us. So it was just a matter of seeing whether anybody would. And we had to readjust how we spent our budget because having had more people than we anticipated, we really wanted to take advantage of as many people's offers of help as possible.
Thank you. Does anybody have any questions? I could ask another one. What have you had a lot of examples of pushback, especially internal pushback that you've had to deal with?
So because it's not yet public, there has yet to be any external. Internally, there is support from within the organization. And I think the pushback that we had was in some cases with the Inclusion Advisory Panel. And actually that was really helpful in us not making terrible mistakes in terms of how we describe things. So if the panel is saying to us, we don't like this, that's a really helpful thing to know. And some of the things were very useful and led to discoveries. So I mentioned Agrippine and the little Welsh woman with her cutaneous horn. The digging that uncovered the existence of Margaret Griffith came because a member of the panel said, well, you know, how is a horn not just magic? And I wouldn't have done that further digging if I hadn't been asked that question. So I was really pleased to get that kind of pushback.
Okay, thank you for clarifying. I think we have one question from Kylie. I was wondering if the guides are focused specifically on the performance collection or reach across the institutional and moving image collection.
So they do include the moving image collection, which it's important to say, unlike some other bits of our archive, which can be accessed directly from the catalogue, the moving image and most of the performing arts section can only be viewed on site through our unique equity agreement. So it does extend slightly more broadly than just performing arts. So it does include institutional figures. Actually, that was really difficult. I suspect there's more work to be done that could be uncovering those figures from the past. An important thing that these guides do for the first time is acknowledge the Jewishness of our founder, Sam Wanamaker. If you were to look in our archive catalogue, the word Jew or Jewish doesn't throw up very much. And one of the things it did throw up was a really horribly anti-Semitic play, The Jew of Malta. And because of how long ago it was catalogued, it didn't say that this was a horribly anti-Semitic play. So it was really important to be adding this in. One of the reasons he was the founder of our organization was because he was one of the victims of the McCarthy witch hunt that stopped him working. That was what led him to come to England, and by being in England, he discovered that whilst there was a plaque on a brewery wall, there wasn't actually a reconstruction of a theatre like the one he'd performed in as a young man in Chicago. So being able to give his Jewish heritage some credit in the race guide, I think is really positive.
Thank you. Anybody else have any other questions for Philip?
Yeah, Philip, I have a question. So you had mentioned about one of the limitations being that some of the older, probably more offensive descriptions were sometimes there was a conflict between certain accuracy of representing what is being described in the catalog. Can you talk a little bit more about how you try to balance that with reducing harm, but with keeping things accurate to the materials that are being searched and described?
Yeah, so as yet, there hasn't been any kind of revisiting of the old catalogue descriptions. So, for example, for current productions, we're taking from the advertisement on the website things like the warnings about the language and themes that are raised in the play. But we don't have that for the early history of the organization, even supposing there were any warnings at all. And clearly that's slightly production specific as to how relevant or significant it is. So it's not easy to just kind of blanket copy something across from a modern production to an older production. What we do have in general on the front page of the website, I mean, it's at least it's somewhere, right? But I guess it's not ideal that it doesn't happen when you access the record itself. We do have a kind of content warning that points out that some of the offence in our collections lies in the text of the plays. That's not to say that there isn't offence in more modern new writing plays potentially. But I think the fact that we're very much an early modern house with occasional forays into other repertoire, it does kind of underline our need to state that these things are in the plays. There's a need to be honest about the fact that they are in the plays, again, in the face of pushback that we're aware of people saying, oh, well, you know, race is too modern a concept for Shakespeare's time, for example, or nobody had disability in the early modern period, there was only stigma, for example. So there are those kind of things lead to kind of press write-ups that are a bit odd. So, for example, when we had casting of Francesca in A Midsummer Night's Dream, the press seemed to think that we had mentioned there was racism, not racism, there was ableism in the play because of the reference to her being a dwarf or a minimus, as if it was only related to her casting rather than the fact that it is in the play anytime anybody chooses to use those words. Is that an answer?
Yes, no, that is. No, thank you so much. I fully appreciate that. It's very complicated with the material that's being worked with. So thank you.
Oh, we have another question from Marcella, who comments, it's really impressive that you've gotten these 4 guides in draft form within a year. How much time have you and other individuals on the grant been able to dedicate to this project to this point? How much time do you expect to dedicate going forward, considering you expect this project to be ongoing?
So until November this year, I only worked here 4 days a week, which meant that the project could pay me to work on some of those other days. So that meant that I had clear, dedicated time to work on the project. You know, if the need arose, other time from my other duties did get spent on it. So it's a bit difficult to tell completely. And like I say, we were paying a researcher. They did, they contributed to some of the content, but I think it's probably fair to say that most of what they did was bibliographical, so that the guides themselves enable people to do their own research afterwards. So we've included a kind of short bibliography of the kind of really important things and the things that you can find immediately in our library. And then there's a much longer bibliography of all the other scholarship. And again, that's something that with our new librarian, who should be starting in January, that will be something that will be slotting into their role to keep that bit up to date. I don't think it will be that difficult to keep it going forward if all we're doing is trying to catch up with the latest productions. We don't have that many. And by September next year, we would be in a position to have got the information we needed for all the productions from this winter season and the summer season. They'd all be cast by then, for example, and all the creatives known. And we would have seen them to know, you know, what themes came up in a particular production. But you know, there are other things. There are other areas that, like, for example, with the institution, where it might be worth doing more digging. We'll see what we have time for. As I mentioned, we're getting supposedly our new reading room being built next year. So there's lots of packing stuff away into boxes and sending it off site and all that kind of stuff. But I'm confident that we can definitely be in charge of the updates. Another kind of dream that I've had is to actually do some of that digging into that example, like the Juliet being like a pearl in an Ethiopian's ear. Some of those things are not very well described or glossed or discussed in editions of the play that students might easily buy. So it may be that there is some work long term that we can do to make those kind of things more visible as well. But don't tell anybody, because that's a thought I've had in my head rather than anything I've discussed with anybody.
I think you addressed part of what Stephanie asked here, but I'll repeat it anyway. Do you have a project plan or framework in place for how to envelop forthcoming productions into the project? So
I guess it doesn't really have a plan, because we'll just keep doing what we did for the seasons up to now. So that, I mean, there are really uncomfortable things about that, particularly I think with relation to race, because we are not we couldn't, for the past history, approach every actor who'd ever worked here and ask them how they would like to be described. We did a bit of that where I was in immediate contact with people, but mostly we're going by, okay, we're saying this, but there's also, as it were, a takedown. Let us know if you think you've been wrongly added, or if we've missed you out and need to be added. So I don't think it's that difficult to do a production. It's not going to take that long. Really, the work has been working out what we're going to do and actually producing it, as it were, at scale for our entire history to now, insofar as we could. I think it will be less of a problem year on year, even in really busy years like next year.
Following up on that, have you communicated with living playwrights for the more newer productions you've staged?
Yeah, so similarly, the creatives also uncontacted. It's kind of a risk, but it wasn't really possible to hunt everybody down. And because it wasn't possible to hunt everybody down, we've gone for hunting more or less nobody down. So it will be interesting to see whether there is any kind of pushback, that word again, from people who've been included in ways that they might not have chosen, or with some of our productions, I'm not going to name names, I'm going to be very diplomatic, but there have been productions with very few women characters and the only woman character being a prostitute, for example. So we've been open about that. We didn't run it past the playwright as to whether they were happy with us describing their work that way.
Thank you. We have time for a few more questions. If anybody has any more they would like to ask, I'll give you a minute to think about it. Have the other departments like education or marketing been able to utilize any of these guides, and they're enthusiastic about it or not?
So yes, there's enthusiasm. They don't have access to them yet. They're also dying for the end of January when we finally have our launch event. But we know that there is demand. So as well as I mentioned our master's students, but in addition to that, we have staff who do work with school teachers. We have staff who do work with school groups. We have people working with young companies. All those kinds of people, it's really going to be very helpful for them to have information about the plays that identifies characters that could be read in a certain way or played in a certain way or interpreted in a certain way. So there is awareness within the organization that it's happening. It's not like that we've been beavering away at this and nobody knows that it's happening, but they haven't seen, in most cases, they haven't seen even as much detail as I've shared with you. Education have seen the work in progress and have seen some of it, but other parts of the organization not yet.
Okay, thank you. So it looks, just have a comment that people have to leave. So that's a good note to close on. And we thank you so much for sharing this with us. And we're looking forward to seeing it when it's launched and hope that it gets the use that you envision for it. It's such a great project.
Well, thank you very much. Thanks for the opportunity to talk about it with people, in some cases, thousands of miles away. will definitely be sharing the links with you, so you could possibly pass those on to the people who subscribed to tonight's event.
Great. Thank you, everybody. And thanks again, Philip, for taking this time out of your evening and enjoy a nice dinner now.
Thank you very much.
Thank you. Bye, everyone.
Bye.
Bye.